That is the number of maritime choke points being blocked simultaneously right now. The first one, the Strait of Hormuz. 6 weeks of war. Thousands of mines. 600 ships stranded. Every headline in the world focused on that 21-mile channel between Iran and Oman. The second one, almost nobody is talking about. On April 10th and 11th, 2026, the exact same days American destroyers were entering the Strait of Hormuz to begin mine-clearing operations, China installed a 352-meter floating barrier across the entrance to the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. 4 fishing vessels, a Chinese naval or Coast Guard ship, 6 maritime militia vessels inside the lagoon, a physical barrier across a waterway that sits entirely within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Let that sink in. While the entire world was watching Hormuz, while every analyst, every diplomat, every news channel was focused on the Middle East, China moved on the Pacific. Quietly. Precisely. On the same day. And almost nobody noticed. This is not a coincidence. This is a strategy. And the documented record of what Beijing has done when it did it, and what it reveals about how China reads American military distraction, that is what this brief is about. I'm James Caldwell. This is Stratford Brief. Let's get into it. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to give you 4 things the headline coverage is not giving you. First, what the Scarborough Shoal actually is, why it matters strategically, and why China has been building toward this moment for 14 years. The floating barrier installed on April 10th did not appear from nowhere. It is the latest step in a documented pattern that most Western analysts are treating as background noise when it should be foreground risk. Second, the timing. Because the specific date China chose to install that barrier, the exact same day American destroyers were entering a mined strait on the other side of the world, is the most analytically significant fact in this entire story. Almost nobody is running the numbers on what that timing reveals. Third, what the United States can actually do about it. And here is where the documented record produces the most uncomfortable answer. Because the assets that would normally respond to Chinese escalation in the South China Sea are currently deployed in the Persian Gulf. 2 carrier strike groups, 11 destroyers, the mine-clearing fleet. All of it is in the Middle East right now. Fourth, what this tells us about the next phase of this conflict. Because if China is moving on Pacific territory while America is in the Middle East, the question is not whether Beijing is watching the Iran war as an opportunity. The question is what opportunity Beijing thinks it has, and how long America's distraction is going to last. Stay with me. Each layer changes how you read the one before it. Let us start with the Scarborough Shoal itself. Because to understand what China did on April 10th and 11th, you need to understand what this place is and why it matters. The Scarborough Shoal, known as Bajo de Masinloc in the Philippines and Huangyan Island in China, is a triangular chain of reefs and rocks with a central lagoon in the eastern South China Sea. It is not large, it is not inhabited, but its location is what makes it strategically consequential. It sits approximately 120 nautical miles west of the Philippine island of Luzon, well inside the Philippines' internationally recognized exclusive economic zone. It sits approximately 470 nautical miles from the coast of China. By every metric of international maritime law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, this is Philippine territory. China does not recognize that. China seized the Scarborough Shoal in 2012 after a standoff with Philippine vessels. A 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration backed Manila on several South China Sea issues and found that China's presence at the shoal violated international law as it was a traditional fishing ground for multiple nations. China refused to accept the ruling. Beijing has never acknowledged it. And since 2012, China has maintained a continuous deployment of Coast Guard and fishing trawler vessels at the shoal, gradually, incrementally, extending its operational control over a waterway it does not legally own. What happened on April 10th and 11th, 2026, is documented by satellite imagery obtained by Reuters and confirmed by the Philippine Coast Guard. A 352-meter floating barrier was installed across the entrance to the shoal. 4 Chinese fishing vessels were anchored along the entrance. A Chinese naval or Coast Guard patrol vessel was observed just outside the entrance. 6 Chinese maritime militia vessels were identified inside the lagoon. Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson J. Terriella confirmed the installation date and the presence of the militia vessels. Do that arithmetic slowly. 352 meters. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a physical barrier, longer than 3 football fields, blocking the entrance to a waterway that Philippine fishermen have accessed for generations, and that international law says belongs to Manila. And China installed it on April 10th and 11th. The same 2 days, American destroyers were entering the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since February 28th. Before we continue, if this is the analysis you have been looking for, subscribe to Stratford Brief and turn on notifications. We do not report what happened. We report what it means, who decided it, and what the documented pattern reveals. New brief every day. Let's continue. Now let us examine the timing, because this is the part of the story that the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing, and it is the most analytically important part. Almost nobody is asking the question that the timeline demands. China installed a physical barrier across a disputed South China Sea waterway on the exact same days that America's most significant naval assets were transiting a mined strait on the other side of the planet. That is not an approximation. That is not a rough coincidence. That is April 10th and April 11th on both sides of the same news cycle. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a Washington-based security research organization, described China's South China Sea actions in their April 16th analysis in specific terms. Beijing is using gray zone tactics to assert operational control over contested waters, while staying below the threshold for armed conflict and limiting the risk of a direct U.S. response. These incremental steps, while individually limited, cumulatively shift the status quo in Beijing's favor without triggering a kinetic response. That framing is precise, and it explains the timing. China did not install the barrier when American carriers were in the South China Sea conducting freedom of navigation operations. China did not move when American attention was focused on the Pacific. China moved when American attention and American naval assets were elsewhere. Specifically, when they were in the Persian Gulf clearing Iranian mines and managing the world's most watched energy crisis. Diplomats told Reuters explicitly, and this is in the documented record, that Beijing's actions are being watched closely amid fears that China could take advantage of perceptions that the United States is distracted by the Iran conflict and its effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Take advantage of perceptions of distraction. That is the diplomatic language for a documented strategic calculation. Beijing assessed that America's attention was elsewhere, that America's assets were elsewhere, and that the cost of installing a 352-meter barrier on April 10th was lower than it would be on any other day in the past 6 months. And Beijing was right. The United States has not formally responded to the Scarborough Shoal barrier installation. The Philippines deployed Coast Guard and fisheries vessels. The Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson condemned the installation publicly. The United States, which has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, has been focused on Hormuz. Let that land properly. China installed a physical barrier across a waterway inside a treaty ally's exclusive economic zone, and the response from Washington has been silence, not because Washington doesn't care, because Washington is managing a naval blockade, a mine-clearing operation, a collapsed diplomatic process in Pakistan, and an energy crisis that is costing the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars every month. The clock is not just running in the Strait of Hormuz, it is running in the South China Sea too. And the two clocks are connected in ways that almost nobody is explaining. Now let us examine what the United States can actually do about the Scarborough Shoal right now, because this is where the documented record produces the most uncomfortable answer in this entire brief. The CSIS China Power Analysis published in February 2026, tracking Chinese military activities in the Indo-Pacific, documented that China's Coast Guard more than doubled its presence around the Scarborough Shoal in 2025 compared to 2024. 163 recorded Chinese military operations in the South China Sea in 2025 alone, a record number of live fire drills. The pattern was already escalating before February 28th, before the Iran war began. What the Iran war did was remove the counterpressure. The assets that would normally respond to Chinese escalation in the South China Sea are documented and specific. The U.S. 7th Fleet, forward deployed in the Pacific, typically includes carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, and surveillance assets that conduct freedom of navigation operations near disputed features. The Philippines-US Mutual Defense Treaty creates an obligation to respond to armed attacks on Philippine forces, vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. But here is the documented reality of where those assets are right now. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is in the Middle East. The USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group is deployed in the Mediterranean and has assets near the Persian Gulf. According to U.S. Central Command, 11 destroyers are currently operating in the Middle East region. The mine-clearing fleet, the Avenger-class minesweepers, the littoral combat ships with countermeasures packages, is en route to or already operating in the Persian Gulf. The 7th Fleet still exists. American naval assets in the Pacific have not been completely stripped, but the concentration of high-end naval power, the carrier strike groups, the destroyer flotillas, the specialized mine-clearing assets, is in the Middle East. And China knows this. The satellite imagery of the Scarborough Shoal barrier was installed precisely when China's intelligence assessed that the cost-benefit calculation favored moving. The Vision Times analysis published April 16th, citing military experts including former military official Grant Newsham, stated directly, China has de facto control of the South China Sea and continues to tighten control by building and improving artificial islands and bases, and by incrementally establishing operational facts that become difficult to reverse without direct conflict. The word to hold is incremental. The 352-meter barrier is not an invasion. It is an increment. It does not cross the threshold that would trigger a formal treaty response. It does not constitute an armed attack on Philippine forces. It is a physical barrier, gray zone action, that advances Chinese operational control one step further, while the mechanism for pushback is occupied elsewhere. This is the strategic logic of what China did on April 10th. And a rigorous analysis requires acknowledging the counterargument before accepting that conclusion. The counterargument is legitimate. Several analysts covering Chinese behavior in the South China Sea argue that the Scarborough Shoal barrier escalation was planned and scheduled independently of the Iran conflict, that China's maritime calendar runs on its own strategic timeline, and that reading the April 10th timing as deliberate opportunism projects more coordination than the evidence supports. That argument deserves respect. It is the strongest version of the alternative reading available, but here is what it requires you to accept. China installed a 352-meter physical barrier across a disputed South China Sea waterway. On the same 2 days, American destroyers were making their first transit of a mined Persian Gulf Strait since a war began 6 weeks earlier. China's defense ministry did not respond to Reuters' requests for comment on the deployment or its timing. And diplomats, multiple diplomats on the record in Reuters reporting, explicitly raised the concern that China might be taking advantage of American distraction. When multiple diplomats say out loud that they are worried about a specific pattern, and the documented timeline matches that pattern precisely, the burden of proof is on the alternative reading. The clock is running in the South China Sea, not the same clock as Hormuz, slower, more patient, measured in increments rather than days. But it is running. Let me give you the timeline that most Western coverage is not connecting to the Iran war, because these two situations are not separate stories. They are the same story viewed from two different oceans. The Iran war began February 28th. By early March, American carrier strike groups were repositioning to the Persian Gulf and Mediterranean. By mid-March, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. By April, America's high-end naval concentration was at its highest level in the Middle East in years. Meanwhile, in the South China Sea, the China Power Project at CSIS documented that Chinese military activities in the South China Sea reached record levels in 2025. China approved the establishment of a national nature reserve at the Scarborough Shoal last year, a move Philippine security officials called a clear pretext for occupation. 10 Chinese Coast Guard vessels were sighted at the shoal from April 5th to April 12th, according to Philippine Navy spokesperson Roy Trinidad. The floating barrier was installed April 10th to 11th. The pattern does not require the Iran war to be the cause of the Scarborough Shoal escalation. The escalation was already building. What the Iran war did was remove the counter-pressure at the precise moment the escalation reached its most visible step. thousands of American and Philippine troops are beginning large-scale exercises across the Philippine archipelago this month. The annual Balikatan exercises, now joined by Japan for the first time, acknowledging exactly the threat environment these drills are designed to address. Those exercises include components in Zambales province, whose coast is approximately 120 nautical miles from the Scarborough Shoal. That is the military response available to the United States right now. Joint exercises. Symbolic proximity. Not carrier strike groups. Not freedom of navigation operations into the lagoon of a shoal, where a 352-meter barrier now blocks the entrance. And here's the question that ties both oceans together. The Strait of Hormuz ceasefire expires around April 22nd. The Islamabad negotiations have not been reconvened. Trump says a deal is close. He said the same thing before Islamabad collapsed. If the ceasefire expires without a framework, American military attention in the Middle East intensifies, not reduces. The carrier strike groups do not come home. The 7th Fleet does not get reinforced. And China's window of reduced counterpressure in the South China Sea extends. The two clocks are not independent. They are connected by a single mechanism, the finite concentration of American naval power that cannot be in the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea simultaneously at full strength. Let me give you the assessment the documented record demands. China installed a 352-meter physical barrier across the entrance to the Scarborough Shoal on April 10th and 11th, 2026. This is documented by satellite imagery, confirmed by the Philippine Coast Guard, and described by multiple diplomats as a potential exploitation of American distraction. The United States has not formally responded. The Philippines has deployed Coast Guard vessels. The barrier is still there. The Iran war has concentrated American high-end naval power in the Middle East at levels not seen in years. The Scarborough Shoal barrier was installed on the exact days that America's mine-clearing destroyers made their first transit of the Hormuz Strait since February 28th. China's defense ministry declined to comment on the timing. The documented pattern, not the one-time event, but the 14-year pattern of Chinese incremental control over the Scarborough Shoal, moved one step further on April 10th. And that step was taken at the moment of maximum American distraction and minimum American counterpressure in the Pacific. 2 choke points, 2 oceans, 1 finite supply of American naval power, and a clock that is running on both sides of the world simultaneously. The question this brief cannot answer, but the one that the next 30 days will begin to force, is which clock America responds to first when the ceasefire expires. And the diplomatic process in the Middle East demands attention, and China's barrier in the South China Sea is still there. Because here is what the documented record of American foreign policy since 2001 shows about choosing between 2 simultaneous crises in different theaters. You cannot fully solve both at once. And whichever one you choose to manage second, the other side takes another step. Watch the Hormuz negotiations. Watch the Balikatan exercises. And watch the satellite imagery of the Scarborough Shoal entrance. The barrier is 352 meters long. It did not arrive suddenly, and it is not going anywhere on its own. The mainstream coverage tells you what happened. Stratford Brief tells you what it means. New brief tomorrow. I'm James Caldwell. Stay sharp.